Mary had always considered herself her father's closest confidant, particularly after her mother passed away when Mary was just a teenager. Her father, George, had been a hard-working mechanic who wore his modesty like a badge of honor, constantly reminding her that the greatest wealth lay in relationships, not material possessions. That was why, as she sat cross-legged in the attic of her childhood home, she felt her chest tighten at the sight of an unfamiliar, faded envelope sticking out of a battered book. The attic, filled with the scent of aged wood and dust, had been her sanctuary in the days following George's passing, a place where she could lose herself in memories. But this envelope, with its yellowed paper and George's familiar cursive handwriting, was unlike anything else she had uncovered. It was addressed simply to "My darling Mary" and bore no date, as if its contents had been meant for her eyes only at some indeterminate point in the future. With trembling hands, Mary unfolded the letter, her heart pounding harder with each word she read. The letter spoke cryptically about a matter of great importance and referenced a bank account number alongside an address to a now-defunct branch of a bank she barely recognized. Her initial reaction was disbelief. Her father had always been upfront about their financial struggles, working long hours to ensure Mary could pursue her education and enjoy a modest but fulfilling life. How could he have hidden something as significant as a bank account from her? Her shock turned to disbelief as she read on, realizing that George had deliberately left no explanation for the account's existence, only a vague instruction to contact the bank should circumstances require it. The letter was signed with the words, "For when the time is right." Determined to uncover the truth, Mary pushed aside her emotions and focused on the task at hand. She spent hours online, researching the bank, only to find that the branch had closed decades ago. When she finally located the main office's contact information, she hesitated, holding the phone in her hand as doubts crept into her mind. What if this was all a mistake, a relic of her father's younger days with no real significance? But curiosity and the need for closure drove her to dial the number. The conversation with the bank's representative was surreal. After providing the account details, Mary was informed that not only was the account active, but also contained an astonishing balance, well into the six figures. Her heart raced as she struggled to process what she had just learned. George, the man who had insisted on budgeting every penny and who always seemed to be just getting by, had somehow amassed a fortune. But why had he kept it hidden? And why leave it untouched? Questions swirled in her mind, each one more perplexing than the last. Unable to contain her curiosity, Mary requested a detailed statement for the account, hoping it would offer some clarity. When the documents arrived days later, her confusion deepened. The deposits were sporadic, some dating back more than 30 years, and the sources were cryptic, with references to companies and individuals she had never heard of. Mary's search for answers quickly consumed her. She began rifling through boxes of her father's belongings, hoping to find anything that could explain the mystery. It was during one of these late-night searches, surrounded by stacks of old papers and photographs, that she found another envelope, this time hidden inside a rusted toolbox. Inside was a faded photograph that made her breath catch in her throat. The image showed George, younger and smiling, standing beside a woman she didn't recognize. What truly shook Mary, however, was the presence of two young children in the photo, children who bore a striking resemblance to her father. The discovery hit Mary like a thunderbolt. The bank account wasn't just a financial anomaly. It was a gateway to a side of her father she had never known. The photograph, along with the mysterious deposits, suggested a narrative far more complex than she could have imagined. George, the man she had idolized as a loving and devoted father, had clearly lived a life filled with secrets. As Mary stared at the photograph, her hands trembling, she felt a wave of emotions crash over her: grief, confusion, betrayal, and an almost unbearable curiosity. Who were the woman and children in the photo? Were they connected to the money? And most importantly, What kind of man had her father truly been? The mystery felt like a puzzle with missing pieces, and Mary was determined to fit them together, no matter what it took. The attic, once a space of nostalgia and comfort, now felt like a vault of secrets she was only beginning to unlock. As she sat surrounded by the remnants of her father's life, she realized that this journey wasn't just about uncovering the truth of the bank account. It was about uncovering the truth of George himself. Mary resolved to follow the trail wherever it led, even if it meant confronting painful truths about the man she thought she knew. The road ahead felt uncertain and daunting, but Mary knew she had no choice but to see it through. Mary's world had already begun to shift after the discovery of the bank account and the mysterious photograph, but nothing could have prepared her for the seismic revelations that lay ahead. Determined to get to the bottom of her father's double life, she started by carefully examining the photograph she had found in the toolbox. It was old and faded, but the details were clear enough to leave no doubt. The woman in the picture had a warm smile and a confident demeanor, standing close to George in a way that felt intimate, almost familial. The children, a boy and a girl, looked to be about 5 and 7, and their expressions radiated the innocent joy of a day well spent with someone they trusted deeply. What struck Mary the most was the boy's eyes. They were the same shade of piercing blue as her father's, a color that had always been one of George's most distinctive features. The more she stared at the photograph, the more questions flooded her mind. Who was this woman? Were the children her half-siblings? How had George managed to keep such a significant part of his life hidden for so many years? Though her heart ached at the possibility that her father had harbored secrets from her, Mary felt an undeniable pull to uncover the truth. She decided to start with the simplest lead she had, the address scribbled on the back of the photograph. It was a town about 30 miles away, a place Mary vaguely remembered hearing about in passing but had never visited. The drive there was a blur of emotions, anticipation, anxiety, and an undercurrent of dread. She arrived at a quiet suburban neighborhood lined with modest homes, each one marked by neatly trimmed hedges and well-kept lawns. The address led her to a small house with white siding and a red door, a place that exuded a comforting charm. Mary hesitated for what felt like an eternity, her fingers hovering over the doorbell as her mind raced through possible scenarios. What if she was wrong? What if the photograph meant something entirely different? But the unanswered questions gnawed at her, and with a deep breath, she pressed the button. The woman who opened the door looked older, but unmistakably familiar. Her hair, now streaked with gray, was tied back in a simple bun, and her face bore the gentle lines of age, each wrinkle a testament to years of living. Mary couldn't help but compare her features to those in the photograph. The shape of her nose, the curve of her lips, they were identical. For a moment, neither of them spoke, both women staring at each other as though searching for the right words. Finally, Mary cleared her throat, her voice trembling as she introduced herself and explained why she was there. The woman, whose name was Eleanor, visibly stiffened at the mention of George's name. Her eyes softened with a mix of recognition and sadness, and she invited Mary inside. The house was cozy, filled with the scent of freshly baked bread and the faint sound of a radio playing old jazz tunes in the background. As they sat down in the living room, Eleanor's demeanor shifted from guarded to resigned, as though she had been expecting this moment for years. "I wondered if someone might come looking," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "I always thought it might be him, though. Not his daughter." Mary listened intently as Eleanor began to speak, her words peeling back layers of a story Mary had never imagined. George had met Eleanor when he was in his late 20s, during a period of his life Mary knew little about. They had fallen in love quickly, and their relationship had led to the birth of 2 children, Michael and Susan. But George had never stayed. According to Eleanor, he had always been distant, visiting sporadically and never fully committing to their life together. Over time, his visits became less frequent, and eventually, they stopped altogether. Eleanor had assumed he'd moved on, though she never truly understood why. As Eleanor spoke, Mary's heart ached for her father's other family. The pain in Eleanor's voice was palpable, and Mary couldn't help but feel a strange mix of sorrow and anger. She thought about the nights she and her father had spent together, laughing over shared jokes and watching old movies, and wondered if there had been a part of him that had longed for Michael and Susan during those moments. How could a man who seemed so devoted to her have left an entire family behind? Just as Mary was beginning to process Eleanor's words, a young man entered the room, his face immediately filling with confusion at the sight of Mary. "This is my son, Michael," Eleanor said, introducing him hesitantly. Mary's breath caught as she looked at him, noticing the unmistakable resemblance to George in his sharp cheekbones and piercing blue eyes. Michael was guarded at first, his tone clipped as he questioned who Mary was and why she was there. But as she explained her story, his expression softened, replaced by a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. The conversation stretched on for hours, punctuated by moments of silence, as they tried to make sense of the tangled web George had left behind. Eleanor showed Mary photographs and letters George had sent over the years, each one offering glimpses of a man who seemed both familiar and foreign. Mary shared her own memories, painting a picture of a father who had been her rock, her guide, and her greatest source of love. Together, they began to piece together a narrative of a man who had lived two lives, each filled with its own joys and sorrows. By the time Mary left, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow over the neighborhood. Her heart felt heavier than ever, weighed down by the knowledge of her father's double life. But amidst the pain and confusion, she felt a flicker of something else: connection. For all the questions that remained unanswered, one thing was clear: her family had just grown larger in the most unexpected of ways. Mary returned home with her mind reeling from her meeting with Eleanor and Michael. The revelation of her father's second family had shaken her to her core, but it had also deepened her resolve to understand the mystery surrounding the forgotten bank account. If this secret life was tied to the money, then uncovering its origins might be the only way to untangle the threads of her father's past. The financial statements she had received from the bank provided a starting point, but they raised more questions than answers. The deposits spanned decades, beginning around the time her father had supposedly left Eleanor's family for good. The amounts were irregular, some modest, others shockingly large, and the sources were cryptic, often listed under company names or anonymous wire transfers. Mary spent the next several days buried in research, her dining table transformed into a makeshift detective's office. Papers were spread out in chaotic piles, sticky notes covered with hastily scribbled connections, and her laptop constantly pinged with notifications from emails and search engines. One name, in particular, stood out among the transactions: Ravenhurst Logistics. The company appeared multiple times on the statements, always linked to substantial deposits. Yet when Mary searched for it online, she found almost nothing, just a sparse website with a generic logo and a disconnected phone number. It was as if the company had existed in the shadows, leaving only faint traces of its presence. Frustrated but undeterred, Mary turned to local records, hoping to find any mention of Ravenhurst Logistics. Her search eventually led her to an old article in the archives of a small-town newspaper. The article, dated over 30 years ago, detailed a scandal involving the company and its alleged involvement in smuggling operations. The accusations were vague, and no charges had ever been filed, but the story hinted at a web of illegal activities that stretched across state lines. Mary felt a chill run down her spine. Could her father have been involved in something criminal? The thought seemed impossible to reconcile with the man she had known, yet the evidence was mounting. Desperate for more information, Mary decided to visit the address listed for Ravenhurst Logistics in the article. The building was located in an industrial park on the outskirts of town, a crumbling relic of its former self. The sign above the entrance was faded, the letters barely legible, and the windows were covered with grime. As Mary stepped inside, the air smelled of dust and neglect, and the sound of her footsteps echoed through the empty halls. She was about to leave when she noticed a stack of old file boxes in a corner, each labeled with a company's name. Sifting through the files, Mary uncovered documents that painted a clearer picture of Ravenhurst Logistics operations. Among the invoices and shipping records, she found a ledger that listed names, dates, and amounts that matched some of the deposits in the bank account. Her father's name appeared several times, always tied to significant sums of money. The discovery confirmed her worst fears. George had been involved with the company, though the exact nature of his role remained unclear. Was he a willing participant in their schemes, or had he been caught up in something beyond his control? As Mary delved deeper, she found a letter addressed to her father from a man named Richard Calloway, who appeared to have been an executive at Ravenhurst Logistics. The letter, written in formal but urgent tones, mentioned a final payment and expressed gratitude for George's discretion and loyalty. Mary's hand shook as she read the words, her mind racing with possibilities. The letter didn't provide specifics, but it hinted at a deal that had allowed George to walk away with a significant sum of money. Conflicted and overwhelmed, Mary reached out to Eleanor, hoping she might have insights into this chapter of George's life. When they met again, Eleanor admitted that George had always been secretive about his work during the years he was involved with Ravenhurst Logistics. He would disappear for days, sometimes weeks, Eleanor recalled, her voice tinged with bitterness. When he came back, he'd never say where he'd been or what he'd done. All he'd tell me was that he was doing it for the kids, for their future. Mary couldn't ignore the irony of Eleanor's words. Her father had justified his actions as being for the benefit of one family, while abandoning another entirely. Yet the money in the bank account suggested that George had never fully left either family behind. As Mary drove home that evening, her thoughts were a storm of conflicting emotions. She wanted to hate her father for his secrets, for the lies he had told and the pain he had caused. But she also couldn't deny the sacrifices he had made, even if they were shrouded in moral ambiguity. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, but the picture they formed was far from clear. Mary still didn't know the full extent of her father's involvement with Ravenhurst Logistics, or whether the money in the account was entirely clean. She couldn't help but wonder if her father had carried the weight of these secrets in silence, unable or unwilling to share them with anyone. And as she stared at the ledger and the letter one more time, she realized that the answers she sought might not bring closure. They might only raise more questions. Yet for all the uncertainty, one thing was clear. George's life had been far more complex than Mary had ever imagined. He had lived with contradictions, balancing love and betrayal, loyalty and deception, generosity and greed. And now, as Mary stood on the brink of uncovering the full truth, she found herself questioning not just who her father had been, but who she was as his daughter. The realization that her father's actions had tied her life to strangers was both unsettling and strangely compelling for Mary. The photograph, Eleanor's stories, and the trail of mysterious deposits painted a picture of a man who had navigated two worlds with painstaking care. But no matter how much she learned from documents and recollections, Mary knew she wouldn't fully understand the truth until she met the other family, the children who shared her father's blood. Though the idea filled her with apprehension, she couldn't shake the feeling that meeting them was the next step in untangling this web of secrets. After exchanging a few tentative messages with Michael, Eleanor's son, they agreed to meet at a neutral location, a small cafe in the heart of the town where George's second family had lived. Mary arrived early, her nerves betraying her calm exterior as she fidgeted with her coffee cup. She tried to imagine what Michael and Susan might be like now, decades after her father had left their lives. Would they resent her? Would they even want to speak to her? The possibilities were endless, and none of them felt comforting. When Michael walked in, Mary recognized him immediately. His resemblance to George was undeniable, from the sharp lines of his jaw to the way he carried himself with quiet confidence. Behind him was Susan, whose gentle features contrasted with Michael's intensity. As they approached her table, Mary felt her breath hitch, the enormity of the moment settling on her shoulders like a heavy weight. The initial moments were awkward, filled with polite greetings and the kind of stiff small talk that masks deeper emotions. Mary noticed the way Susan avoided her gaze, her fingers drumming nervously on the table, while Michael seemed more composed but no less guarded. It wasn't until Mary, unable to bear the tension any longer, blurted out, "I don't know how to begin this conversation," that the atmosphere shifted. Susan let out a nervous laugh, and Michael cracked a small, reluctant smile. "Neither do we," he admitted, his voice carrying the same calm cadence Mary remembered from her father. Slowly, the conversation began to flow. Michael and Susan shared fragments of their lives, painting a picture of a childhood that was both ordinary and shadowed by George's absence. They spoke of birthdays missed, letters received sporadically, and the way their mother had tried to explain George's choices without fully understanding them herself. Susan, in particular, seemed to carry the weight of unspoken emotions, her voice trembling as she described the time she had waited by the window, hoping her father would appear. "I used to think he didn't care," she said quietly, her words piercing Mary's heart. "But now I wonder if it was more complicated than that." Mary shared her own stories in return, recounting memories of George that felt almost surreal in light of what she now knew. She told him about his love of classic cars, his habit of humming old tunes as he worked, and the way he would light up whenever she accomplished something he was proud of. As the hours passed, they began to bridge the gap between their worlds, finding unexpected connections in their shared experiences. But for all the warmth that began to emerge, there were also moments of tension. Michael questioned why George had chosen to leave their family behind while staying in Mary's life. "Did he ever talk about us?" he asked, his tone edged with bitterness. Mary hesitated, knowing that honesty was the only way forward. "Not in the way you'd want," she admitted. "But I think he carried you with him, even if he couldn't say it." The conversation grew heavier as they turned to the subject of the bank account. Michael and Susan had known nothing about it, and the revelation seemed to unsettle them as much as it had Mary. "If that money was meant for us, he never said anything," Susan murmured, her brows furrowing in thought. "But if it wasn't, then who was it for?" The question hung in the air, unspoken but understood by all of them. By the end of the meeting, Mary felt emotionally drained but also strangely at peace. She had taken a step into a world that had once felt impossibly foreign, and though it was still fraught with unanswered questions, it no longer felt like an impenetrable barrier. As they parted ways, Michael extended a tentative offer. "Maybe we should do this again. I think there's more we need to figure out together." Mary nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude and a faint sense of hope. "I'd like that," she replied, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. She watched as Michael and Susan walked away, their silhouettes blending into the bustling crowd, and felt a strange mixture of loss and connection. They were strangers, yet they were family, bound together by a man whose choices had shaped all their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. As she drove home, the memory of their conversation replayed in her mind. For the first time since this journey began, Mary felt as though she wasn't alone in her search for answers. She had found allies in Michael and Susan, people who shared her pain, her curiosity, and her need for closure. Together, they were piecing together a puzzle that might never be complete, but every fragment brought them closer to understanding the man they had all loved and lost. The drive back from her meeting with Michael and Susan left Mary in a haze of conflicting emotions. While the initial encounter had been civil, almost cathartic, she couldn't shake the undercurrent of tension that simmered beneath their polite words. The reality of her father's double life was no longer just a theory supported by photographs and documents. It It was now embodied in the faces and voices of two people who had lived an entirely different version of the man she had called Dad. As Mary pulled into her driveway and stepped into her quiet home, she felt the weight of everything she had learned pressing down on her like a heavy quilt. Over the next few days, the emotional fallout of her discoveries began to take its toll. Mary found herself grappling with an overwhelming sense of betrayal. George had always been her hero, the man who had taught her to ride a bike, cheered the loudest at her school plays, and stayed up late helping her with math homework. How could that same man have abandoned another family, leaving Michael and Susan to grow up with unanswered questions and unfulfilled promises? The thought stung like a fresh wound, and every time she tried to rationalize his actions, she found herself hitting a wall of anger and confusion. The anger wasn't confined to George either. Mary began to question everything about her own life. Had her mother known about this other family? Was their seemingly perfect home life just a facade built on lies? The possibility that her mother had been complicit in keeping the secret left Mary feeling untethered, as though the foundation of her identity had been pulled out from under her. Late at night, she would sit in her father's old armchair, surrounded by the echoes of her childhood, and wrestle with a single, unrelenting question. Was George the man she had loved, or was he a stranger hiding behind a mask of fatherly devotion? To make matters worse, her interactions with Michael and Susan, while promising, were far from smooth. They exchanged messages and even arranged a second meeting, but the conversations often veered into uncomfortable territory. Michael, ever the pragmatist, wanted answers about the money and seemed eager to uncover any hidden assets or accounts. Susan, on the other hand, was more interested in the emotional side of their shared history. "Do you think he ever regretted leaving us?" she asked Mary one afternoon, her voice tinged with vulnerability. The question left Mary speechless, as it echoed her own unspoken fears. Mary's attempts to reconcile her father's choices with the man she had known were further complicated by her growing connection with Eleanor. The older woman, despite her initial hesitation, began to open up, sharing stories about George that were both illuminating and painful. "He loved you," Eleanor said one evening as they sat on her porch, sipping tea under the fading light of the setting sun. "He talked about you all the time. But I think he didn't know how to love all of us at once. So he chose you." The words, though meant to comfort, only deepened Mary's internal conflict. Was George's decision to stay with her family an act of love or a betrayal of his other children? Could it be both? And what did it say about her own life, built on the foundation of a choice that had caused so much pain to others? The questions swirled in her mind, each one more unsettling than the last. The tension reached a breaking point one evening when Mary received a call from Michael. His tone was sharp, almost accusatory, as he shared his frustrations about their father's legacy. "He left us nothing, Mary," Michael said, his voice rising with anger. "Not just money, nothing. No explanations, no closure. Do you know what it's like to grow up feeling like you weren't enough for your own father?" Mary tried to respond, but her words faltered under the weight of his pain. She wanted to tell him that she understood, that she shared his grief, but how could she when her own experiences of George were so different? After the call, Mary broke down for the first time since this journey had begun. She sobbed into her hands, the tears carrying a mixture of guilt, anger, and an aching sense of loss. She cried for Michael and Susan, for the father she thought she knew, and for the fractured family they were all struggling to piece together. The emotional walls she had built around herself began to crumble, leaving her raw and exposed. In the days that followed, Mary began to confront her feelings head-on. She wrote long letters to George, pouring out her anger and sorrow, even though she knew he would never read them. She revisited the old photographs and letters she had found, searching for clues to the man he had been. And slowly, she began to see him not as a hero or a villain, but as a deeply flawed human being who had made choices, some good, some bad, all irrevocable. Her conversations with Michael and Susan also began to take on a different tone. They started to move past the initial bitterness and towards something resembling understanding. "Maybe he didn't know how to be everything to everyone," Susan said one afternoon as they sat together in a park. "Maybe he did the best he could." Michael, though still guarded, began to soften as well, sharing stories of the few happy memories he had of George. For Mary, the journey was far from over, but she began to feel a sense of clarity. Her father's choices had left a legacy of pain, but they had also created an opportunity for healing and connection. The cracks in their family's foundation might never fully disappear, but they could be mended piece by piece with time and effort. As the days turned into weeks, Mary's journey into her father's hidden life brought her closer to Michael, Susan, and Eleanor, but also brought with it an inevitable reckoning. The more they pieced together George's story, the more the question of the bank account loomed over their fragile, budding relationships. The money still untouched in its account became a symbol of everything George had left unresolved. A legacy as tainted by unanswered questions as it was by its potential to heal old wounds. For Mary, deciding what to do with the money wasn't just a financial decision. It was a test of her values, her capacity for forgiveness, and her ability to honor her father's memory in the face of painful truths. Michael, ever pragmatic, made his stance clear early on. It should be divided equally, he insisted during one of their increasingly frequent meetings. If that money was earned during the time he was involved with our family, or even if it wasn't, it belongs to all of us. It's the only way to make things right. Susan, as was her nature, took a more cautious approach. "I don't think it's about fairness," she said softly. "It's about what Dad wanted. And we don't even know what that was." Mary found herself caught between their perspectives, unable to disagree with either of them. In the quiet hours of the night, Mary wrestled with her own feelings about the money. Part of her felt a deep resentment toward George for leaving her in this impossible position. She had spent her entire life believing she was his only family, and now she was being asked to share not just his memory, but also the tangible fruits of his life's work with people she had only recently met. But another part of her, the part that had grown to care for Michael and Susan as siblings, couldn't deny that they had as much right to the money as she did, perhaps even more. Seeking clarity, Mary turned to Eleanor, whose perspective had become a steadying force throughout this turbulent time. They sat together on Eleanor's porch one afternoon, the air warm with the scent of blooming flowers and the faint hum of cicadas. Mary explained her dilemma, her voice breaking as she admitted how conflicted she felt. "I want to do the right thing," she said, her hands twisting in her lap. "But I don't even know what that is anymore." Eleanor listened quietly, her expression thoughtful. When Mary finished, she reached over and placed a hand on hers. "The right thing," Eleanor said gently, "isn't always the easiest thing. And sometimes it's not even the thing that feels fair. It's the thing that lets you live with yourself when it's all said and done." Eleanor's words stayed with Mary as she tried to make sense of what her father might have wanted. She found herself returning to the letters and photographs she had uncovered, searching for any hint of his intentions. It was during one such search that she stumbled upon a document she hadn't noticed before, a folded piece of paper tucked inside the pages of an old journal. It was a handwritten note, scrawled in George's unmistakable script, and it was addressed to whoever finds this. The note was brief but heartfelt, a reflection on George's regrets and hopes. In it, he admitted that the money in the account was meant to be a second chance for his children, both sets of them. "I didn't do right by all of you," he wrote, the words smudged as though he had paused to wipe away tears. "But if this money can help you build the lives you deserve, then maybe it can be my way of making amends." The letter brought Mary to tears, not just because of the weight of her father's words, but because it gave her the clarity she had been searching for. George had left the money for all of them, a final act of love and responsibility that transcended the mistakes he had made. It was a gesture that carried with it an implicit plea for forgiveness, a plea Mary couldn't ignore. When she shared the letter with Michael and Susan, the atmosphere shifted. Michael, who had been so focused on fairness and practicality, seemed visibly moved, his usual guarded expression giving way to something softer. Susan, tears streaming down her face, whispered, "I always wondered if he thought about us. Now I know he did." Together, the three of them came to an agreement. The money would be divided equally, but not just among the three of them. They decided to set aside a portion for Eleanor, whose sacrifices as a single mother had gone unrecognized for far too long. Another portion will be donated to a charity supporting children in need, a cause they all believed George would have supported. It was a decision that reflected not just fairness, but also the growth they had experienced as individuals and as a family. In the end, the money was no longer a source of tension, but a bridge that connected them. For Mary, the decision to share the inheritance wasn't just about honoring her father's wishes. It was about embracing the family she never knew she had and choosing to build something meaningful from the ashes of his secrets. The process wasn't without its challenges, but it left her with a sense of peace she hadn't felt since this journey began. As they finalized their plans, Mary felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the resolution they had found, but for the relationships that had blossomed along the way. Michael and Susan were no longer strangers. They were her siblings, bound together by a shared history and a shared hope for the future. And though George's actions would always carry a shadow of pain, his final act of generosity had given them the opportunity to rewrite their story together. Even with the decision about the inheritance behind her, Mary knew there were still unanswered questions about her father's life. Questions that lingered in her mind, refusing to let her find complete closure. The note George had left had been both illuminating and enigmatic, providing just enough insight to guide their decision about the money, but leaving countless gaps in the story of who he had been and why he had made the choices he did. Mary, Michael, and Susan found themselves drawn together by this shared curiosity, each of them determined to uncover the truths hidden in the shadows of their father's past. It was Susan who suggested they start with the photographs and letters Eleanor had kept over the years. The old shoebox, tucked away in the back of Eleanor's closet, contained a treasure trove of memories, faded Polaroids, handwritten notes, and postcards from places George had visited. As they sifted through the contents, they began to piece together a timeline of his life, connecting the dots between the man Mary had known and the father Michael and Susan had lost. One photograph in particular caught Mary's eye. It was an image of George standing in front of a modest brick building with a sign that read Ravenhurst Logistics. His expression was serious, almost stern, as though he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. The photo was dated just a few years before Mary was born, during the time George had been involved with a mysterious company. Beneath it was a note scrawled on the back, "To New Beginnings," or the initials matched those of Richard Calloway, the man who had written the letter Mary had found in the company's abandoned office. Intrigued, Mary decided to dig deeper into George's connection to Calloway. Her research led her to a series of articles detailing the rise and fall of Ravenhurst Logistics, which had been embroiled in a scandal involving illegal shipments and tax evasion. While George's name was never mentioned in the reports, the dates and locations lined up eerily well with the timeline of his life. It became clear that whatever role George had played, it had been significant enough to secure his financial stability, and perhaps too morally complex for him to speak about openly. During one of their late-night conversations, Michael posed a question that had been nagging at all of them. Do you think he regretted it? Whatever he did with that company, do you think it kept him up at night? Mary didn't know how to answer. Her father had always seemed at peace, but now she wondered if that peace had been a mask, a way of shielding her from the burdens he carried. As they continued their search, they discovered another layer to George's story, one that added a surprising dimension to his character. Hidden among Eleanor's keepsakes was a small journal, its pages filled with George's tidy handwriting. The entries were sporadic, but they painted a picture of a man who had wrestled deeply with his choices. In one entry, dated just before he left Eleanor's family for good, he wrote, "I'm trying to do right by everyone, but I feel like I'm failing everyone instead. Sometimes I think the only thing I'm good at is leaving." The journal revealed a man who was profoundly aware of his flaws and shortcomings. He had struggled to balance his responsibilities to two families, always feeling as though he was falling short on both sides. One entry, written years later, stood out to Mary. "Mary's smile reminds me why I keep going. She doesn't know it, but she saves me every day. I only hope one day she can forgive me for the things I couldn't tell her." Reading those words brought Mary to tears. For all his mistakes, George had loved deeply, even if he hadn't always known how to show it. His choices had been driven by a desire to protect and provide, though the results had been far from perfect. Sharing the journal with Michael and Susan brought them closer together, as they each found pieces of their father in his words. Susan, who had always been more reserved in her emotions, opened up for the first time about her feelings of abandonment. "I used to think he didn't love us," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But now I see that he did. He just didn't know how to show it." Michael, ever the skeptic, nodded in agreement. "He was a complicated man," he said, "but I think, in his own way, he was trying to do the best he could." The process of piecing together George's past became a journey of healing for all three of them. They began to see him not as a flawless hero or a heartless betrayer, but as a man who had struggled, stumbled, and ultimately done his best with the hand he had been dealt. The photographs, letters, and journal entries offered a window into a man who had loved deeply but imperfectly, a man who had carried the weight of his choices with quiet dignity. In the end, the truth they uncovered wasn't neat or simple, but was enough. It gave them the context they needed to understand their father's actions, the clarity to forgive him, and the perspective to move forward with their own lives. For Mary, it was a reminder that love, no matter how flawed, could still be a force for connection and redemption. Mary had thought she was nearing the end of her journey. She, Michael, and Susan had worked tirelessly to piece together their father's life, and though the story they uncovered was complex and riddled with moral ambiguities, it felt like they had finally begun to understand the man behind the secrets. The inheritance had been divided, relationships were slowly healing, and George's journal had provided the emotional closure they needed. But life, as Mary was about to learn, rarely wraps up neatly. It started with a letter. The envelope arrived unexpectedly one crisp autumn morning, delivered to Mary's home without a return address. She almost dismissed it as junk mail, but the weight of the envelope and the faint scent of old paper caught her attention. Opening it, Mary found a single sheet of paper folded neatly with a message written in an unfamiliar hand. "If you're reading this, it means you've discovered the truth about George. But there's more you don't know. Meet me at the Blackwood Rest Cemetery, Friday at noon. Come alone." The letter left Mary rattled. Who could have sent it? And what more was there to uncover? She debated ignoring it, telling herself that she had already learned enough. But curiosity and an unshakable sense of unfinished business drove her to show up at the cemetery that Friday, her heart pounding with both dread and anticipation. The cemetery was quiet, the only sounds the rustling of leaves in the wind and the faint chirping of birds. As Mary stood among the rows of weathered headstones, she felt an eerie sense of unease. A figure emerged from behind a large oak tree, a man in his 70s with a thin frame and sharp eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. "You must be Mary," he said, his voice gravelly but steady. "I'm Richard Calloway." The name hit Mary like a thunderbolt. Richard Calloway, the man whose name had appeared in the letters and documents tied to Ravenhurst Logistics, the man who had seemingly played a pivotal role in George's secret life. Mary struggled to find her voice, her mind racing with questions. "You knew my father," she finally managed to ask. "I didn't just know him," Richard replied. "I owe him my life." What followed was a story that turned everything Mary thought she knew about her father on its head. Richard explained that Ravenhurst Logistics had been more than just a shady company. It had been a front for smuggling refugees and dissidents out of dangerous situations during the late 1970s and early 1980s. George, Richard revealed, had been one of the key players in the operation, using his skills as a mechanic to modify vehicles and transport people across borders. Mary listened in stunned silence as Richard described how George had risked his life time and again to help others. But it hadn't come without a cost. The money in the bank account, Richard explained, was George's share of the operation's profits, earned compensation for the risks he had taken. He hated taking the money, Richard said, but he knew it was the only way to support his family, both of them. The revelation left Mary reeling. The father she had spent weeks trying to understand, the man she had both loved and resented, wasn't just a man with a secret family or questionable business dealings. He was a man who had carried the weight of life or death decisions, who had lived with a constant fear of being caught, and who had chosen to keep those parts of his life hidden to protect the people he loved. But Richard's story didn't end there. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, weathered envelope. "He asked me to give this to you, in case you ever found out the truth," Richard said, handing it to Mary. Her hand shook as she opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. "My dearest Mary, if you're reading this, it means you've learned more about me than I ever had the courage to share. I wish I could have told you everything, but I was afraid of what you might think, afraid of how the truth might change the way you saw me. The choices I made weren't always good ones. I lied, I hurt people, and I failed to be the man I wanted to be. But everything I did for the people I loved. For you, for your mother, for Michael and Susan. You were my light in the darkness, Mary. You gave me hope when I thought I had none left. I hope you can forgive me for the secrets I kept. I hope you can find it in your heart to see me not as a perfect father, but as a flawed man who tried his best. And I hope that, wherever life takes you, you carry the knowledge that you were loved, deeply, completely, and without reservation. All my love, Dad." Tears streamed down Mary's face as she read the letter, her heart aching with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. George's words were a balm to the wounds left by his secrets, a reminder that even in his silence, he had loved her fiercely. When Mary looked up, Richard was gone, leaving her alone with the letter and her thoughts. She stayed at the cemetery for hours, reflecting on everything she had learned and everything she had yet to fully process. The man she had thought she lost had, in many ways, been a stranger. But he had also been a hero, protector, and above all, her father. As Mary left the cemetery, the weight on her heart felt a little lighter. She didn't have all the answers, and she knew she never would. But she had the truth, the messy, complicated, beautiful truth, and that was enough. Her journey wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt ready to move forward, carrying her father's legacy not as a burden, but as a source of strength.